Alright, I think it's on now. Now for something completely different. I'd like to start out, I want to thank you and the Performance Studies Focus Group and ATHE for giving me the opportunity to come and speak for you guys today. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming to hear me speak. And before I get to my paper, I want to just tell you really quickly about one program that's doing excellent work related to the topic I'm going to be presenting on, and that's the Appalachian Prison Book Project, which is run in conjunction with West Virginia University's English department. And if you're interested in issues of social justice in the judicial system, I'm happy to talk more about that program at the end of the presentation. So the title of my paper is Devil in the Details, Hamlet and the Formal Critique of Eyewitness Testimony in Sleep Deprivation Chamber. There's a folk saying that the devil is in the details, and it's upon details that legal cases revolve. Contradictions, errors, and mistakes undermine the solidity of cases and create reasonable doubt, which is a fundamental principle of the U.S. justice system. To convict someone of a crime, guilt must be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and this proof often relies on the specificity and accuracy of details. Often details in legal cases are supplied through eyewitness testimony, a public performance in which an eyewitness tells a story. However, studies of the human memory are increasingly showing eyewitness testimony to be unreliable. Now, Adam and Adrienne Kennedy's 1996 dream play, Sleep Deprivation Chamber, depicting a trial following an incident of police brutality, takes up this critique of eyewitness testimony as inherently fragmentary and incomplete. We're supposed to see Teddy Alexander, who's a character resembling Adam Kennedy, and I can talk more about those connections afterwards, as a victim of an unjustified and unjustifiable assault by a police officer named Holzer. The trial structure of this play seems to support this. However, even as the Kennedys present Teddy as an assault victim, the texture of Sleep Deprivation Chamber positions him as a victim of a legal system using unreliable evidence. The play's dream quality, with its repetitions, reworkings, and contradictions, evokes the fragmented and contradictory nature of eyewitness accounts and especially trauma victims' testimony. This presentation will focus specifically on how the appropriation of Hamlet functions in the background of the Kennedys' narrative. The problems and contradictions of the ghost's testimony about his own murder in Hamlet build upon other formal and thematic techniques in SDC to undermine the authority of eyewitness testimony as a basis for proving guilt or innocence beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, before discussing Hamlet and its internal contradictions, there are a couple of significant points I wish to make absolutely clear at the outset. First, I'm not suggesting that Teddy may be guilty of assaulting Officer Holzer. I don't think the Kennedys want to open that possibility. Instead, my project is a formal examination of the echoes raised by the appropriation of Hamlet in SDC. My interest here is in the problems created by what Julie Sanders calls the sustained reworking of the source text, inherent in appropriation. Sanders explains that new meanings, applications, and resonance arise through the interchanges of meaning between an adapted text and an adaptation. My interest is in these meanings, applications, and resonances resulting from the interplay of Hamlet and Sleep Deprivation Chamber. In other words, I'm not trying to suggest that Teddy may be guilty. Rather, I'm interested in how the play's meta-theatrical performances and echoes of Hamlet complicate determining Teddy's guilt or innocence by questioning a key form of judicial evidence. The other element to clarify at the outset is how I see the trial format structuring SDC as a kind of meta-theatrical performance. Giving testimony shares a number of significant features with ritual and theater. There's a stage, the witness stand, props, like the book upon which witnesses swear to tell the truth, dialogue in questions and cross-examination, and an audience, which would be at a minimum the judge and jury, and any spectators there, and so on. Now, Richard Schechner actually argues that trials are always dramatic, which is why there are so many successful police and courtroom dramas on TV. Schechner writes, "Courtroom trials are inherently dramatic, and that high-visibility trials of famous people, trials depicting horrendous crimes, and trials of political importance attract multiple audiences arranged in concentric circles. Trials have a dramatic or performative structure," Schechner argues, because they feature attorneys, defendants, witnesses, and so on, performing their roles to construct a story of guilt or innocence, and the entire trial proceedings function under a kind of dramatic tension before building to a verdict. This dramatic tension of waiting for a verdict marks trials as liminal rituals or performances, which Victor Turner theorizes as moving a society or community from one status to another through a transition phase. Turner describes three elements of social ritual: separation, transition, and incorporation, all of which are carried out through culturally sanctioned performances. Turner explains that separation clearly demarcates sacred space and time. It includes symbolic behavior which represents the detachment of the ritual subjects. Thinking judicially, a trial opens when a person puts on a judge's robes and a group of people take the juror's oath. The second stage, transition, involves what Turner describes as a period and area of ambiguity, a sort of social limbo which has few of the attributes of either the preceding or subsequent social statuses or cultural states. This is the trial phase itself, marked by an ambiguity between guilty and not guilty. The community attempts to reorient itself according to the forensic performances of the prosecutor and defending attorneys. Only after the verdict has been reached can the community move to the incorporation phase, number 3, which Turner describes as the return of the subjects to their new, relatively stable, well-defined position in the total society. Through the verdict and the sentence, the judge performatively closes the trial and everyone involved returns to the non-sacred space of a new everyday life, whether as a convict, an ex-juror, or a successful or unsuccessful lawyer. But beyond the theatricality of trials and testimony in general, Sleep Deprivation Chamber depicts a trial meta-theatrically, distinguishing between the official trial being staged and the unofficial case being built against Officer Holzer. Officially, at a sort of narrative level, Teddy is being tried for assaulting Holzer, which is ostensibly the reason why Holzer had beaten Teddy in the first place. This is the meta-theatrical trial which we see performed within the play. However, this is not the real trial of the play. Instead, Sleep Deprivation Chamber functions essentially as a trial of Holzer, with the audience or reader as the jury. Much of what happens in the play seems intended to convince the audience that Teddy posed no threat to Holzer, while Holzer's behavior was blatant and unprovoked police brutality. The repetitions of Teddy's story, both through interrogation and by the unseen questioner, and restaging the beating, function as evidence for the Kennedys' prosecution of Holzer, and the letters that Suzanne, who's Teddy's mother, continually write are good character testimony. Of course, Hamlet, like Sleep Deprivation Chamber, revolves around questions of guilt or innocence, reasonable doubt and certainty, and the reliability of a victim's testimony. Through the play-within-a-play technique of the mousetrap, Hamlet seeks proof for the ghost's testimony against Claudius before taking his revenge. However, the details given by the ghost in 1-5 do not match information we get later in the play. W. Gregg points out that old Hamlet's ghost is not necessarily a dependable source of information. Now, the ghost is quite specific about the nature of the murder. He tells Hamlet, "Upon my secure hour thy uncle stole with juice of cursed Hibonia in a vial, and in the porches of mine ears did pour the leprous distilment." And actually these lines are repeated in Sleep Deprivation Chamber as well. This testimony leaves no room for doubt. The ghost claims that Claudius poured poison in his ear. As we all know, later in the play, Hamlet devises the mousetrap, a play within a play to catch Claudius's guilty conscience. Gregg, however, points out that there's no reasonable way of explaining why Claudius reacts so violently to the performance with words, but remains seemingly, at least based on the text that Shakespeare gives us, unfazed by this action carried out in the dumb show. Gregg concludes, "The manner in which the poison is administered in the dumb show makes even the shadow of a doubt absurd. There is but one rational conclusion. Claudius did not murder his brother by pouring poison into his ear." Now, neither Gregg nor I suggest that Claudius did not murder his brother, because we have Claudius's confession in 3-3. The point here is not whether the crime was committed, but whether the details of the ghost's testimony match information we gain throughout our and Hamlet's continued investigation. In an essay on the uncertainty of knowledge in Hamlet, Stanley Cavell offers further evidence for doubting the ghost's testimony. Cavell suggests that the play's last scene repeats old Hamlet's murder, as Claudius tries to murder the son using the same method as the father: poison. Claudius plots with Laertes to kill Hamlet, either through poison on Laertes' sword or through a drink Claudius will poison. Claudius explains that during the fencing match, when Hamlet calls for drink, I'll prefer him a chalice for the nonce, whereupon but sipping, if you by chance escape your venom stuck, our purpose may hold there. In other words, Claudius plans to kill Hamlet by having him drink poison, which is, as far as I know, the usual method of poisoning someone. Cavell writes, "Why assume, as some critics have been led to do, that Claudius is some kind of Italian connoisseur of routes of poisoning? What Shakespeare shows us is that Claudius poisons by poisoning a drink." I don't know why Claudius is an Italian connoisseur, considering he's a Danish king. In other words, though, Claudius's attempt to poison Hamlet replays the murder of old Hamlet. And this notion of repetition is central to Hamlet, at least according to Marjorie Garber's psychoanalytic and deconstructive reading. She identifies the central role that repetition compulsion plays in Shakespeare's play, noting, "Repetition and the repetition compulsion are figured throughout Hamlet. In the double play, dumb show, and dialogue, their double existence never satisfactorily explained despite the ingenuity of critics. In the Queen's two marriages, the twin husbands, in the double murder of fathers, Hamlet's father killed by Claudius, Laertes' father killed by Hamlet." Accepting repetition compulsion as a guiding motif in Hamlet, it seems logical that Claudius would repeat the murder of old Hamlet when he attempts to kill young Hamlet. In other words, the Claudius-Laertes plot provides a model of Claudius's methodology as a murderer, and it reperforms one of the traumatic events structuring the movement of Shakespeare's play. The problem this poses is that it undermines the ghost's very specific testimony about the original murder. The repetitions, as a formal element of Hamlet, undermine what might otherwise be an easily accepted testimony. And like its Shakespearean source text, Sleep Deprivation Chamber is marked by repetitions that center around the traumatic encounter, in this case police brutality. Even the opening lines of the Kennedys' play enact this repetition compulsion. The play opens with the student cast, which is a kind of choric figure, twice saying the words Ophelia, betrayal, disillusionment. Ophelia, of course, is another victim of traumatic shocks, and the traumas drive her mad. But to focus on the repetitions as such, one of the effects of the dream play form is that scenes and conversations are performed repeatedly with slight variations. For instance, all the letters that Suzanne writes to the governor and other public officials essentially focus on the same theme. They all more or less appeal to the addressee for help based on Teddy and the Alexander family's good character and history of civic responsibility. And this letter writing does seem to be a compulsion, one which Suzanne is told she needs to control. Ironically, in a letter, Suzanne writes, "I can tell Edelstein, who's Teddy's lawyer, thinks I may jeopardize Teddy's case by writing too many letters. He told me to write 2, one to the governor and one to the county manager. I've written 17, but I haven't told him." This compulsive need to write actually connects in interesting ways to Garber's argument about Hamlet, in which she makes much of the act of writing as both a form of remembering and of forgetting. I don't have time to go into those connections in this presentation, but a larger project might explore those. The repetitions in SDC are a generic component of the dream play, linking the form of the play to the thematic concerns raised by Hamlet. The nonlinear plot of the Kennedys' play allows a lot of opportunity to repeat, to reperform, or to review, particularly repeating the traumatic experience of the beating, both through recurring narrations of Teddy's story and by actually seeing the event performed. Repetitions occur in the content, but also in the forms through which we encounter the repetition. For instance, Teddy is interrogated by the unseen questioner at least 8 different times, and the content of each discussion is relatively similar. The interrogations vary slightly, but essentially in each one, Teddy is asked and provides answers about his encounter with Holzer. Like the ghost of old Hamlet crying out, "Remember me," the unseen questioner here compels Teddy to remember the traumatic encounter, the sight of loss or suffering. And by compelling Teddy to retell, relive, reperform that experience, the Kennedys compel the audience to rehear, relive the violence of the traumatic rupture, which is why it might be more apt to identify Sleep Deprivation Chamber as a nightmare play rather than a dream play. But whether we label Sleep Deprivation Chamber a nightmare or a dream play, I think the same principle holds true. The phantasmatic quality disrupts any illusion of realism. The repetition and fragmented form mirrors the thematic content of the traumatized and terrified psyche. This disorienting effect is the nature of trauma. Slavoj Žižek writes, Freud started out with the notion of trauma as something that, from outside, intrudes into our psychic life and disturbs its balance, throwing out of joint the symbolic coordinates that organize our experience. I thought about doing that quote in my best Žižek impression, but I passed it up. Dream plays, like trauma victims, frequently rely on impressions, emotions, and ideas rather than facts and details as a realist play might. Therefore, the play performs a critique of a legal framework that looks closely at details of various testimonies. As we seek the kind of certainty about detail upon which law cases are built, the waters of SDC become purposefully murkier. Each of the testimonies in the Kennedys play has its own set of concerns and its own contradictions and revisions. Again, characteristic of eyewitness testimony. To clarify this, I want to return to the murder of Old Hamlet and the inconsistencies between the ghost's account and the information we get later in the play. We see similar minor inconsistencies with the information about the beating given in Sleep Deprivation Chamber. The form of the dream play, combined with inconsistencies about the event and slight omissions, expose the problematic nature of all testimonies offered in the play, and by extension, testimony as a form of evidence. Teddy's narrative of the beating competes with the alternate versions of events David Alexander, who's Teddy's father, and Officer Holzer introduce, and through this polyvocalization, the Kennedys' critique of eyewitness testimony becomes more evident. Further evidence for this critique comes in David's testimony, in which Officer Summers plays a prominent role. Now, who's Officer Summers? Why hasn't she been mentioned yet? Well, she hasn't been mentioned yet because no one other than David talks much about her. It's only for him that Officer Summers plays a significant role, and even his memory of her is vague at best. He describes her as a black female, but he can't describe the gun she had, even whether it was black, gold, or silver, a revolver, or an automatic. When David is examined by the lawyer, he admits that he doesn't even know if anyone else saw Officer Summers with her gun drawn. The lawyer asks, did any of them, the other witnesses, say they had seen an officer with a drawn gun? And David can only reply, I don't think so, I'm not sure. An armed officer does seem like a fairly important detail in a case of police brutality, and yet this detail barely registered in anyone other than David's memory of the assault. Now, this is a typical problem of eyewitness accounts, particularly from traumatized victims. The details that play a major role in some accounts will be totally absent from other testimonies, which makes it very difficult to determine how important a specific aspect of the event actually was. The story is further complicated by Officer Holzer's testimony, offering a contrasting version of the assault, admittedly one undermined by its own inconsistencies. Holzer's version of the beating conflicts with the testimonies of Teddy and David, and the inconsistencies of these testimonies may result from the jumbled perception of trauma victims, and I'd note here that committing a violent act can be a traumatic experience as well. Now, both David's and Holzer's statements expose problems with eyewitness testimony, that there are often more errors and inconsistencies, and details become magnified disproportionately to confuse the testimony. The Kennedys take on issues of eyewitness unreliability in Sleep Deprivation Chamber. The dream quality and the multiple testimonies, the details of which conflict with one another, cast doubt on the veracity of all and any testimony about what happened on the night of the beating. Evoking Hamlet, and particularly evoking the ghost's problematic testimony, contributes to this critique. This is, I think, the main reason the Kennedys appropriated Hamlet as a source text for their play. Again, the basic question of both plays is not guilt. Claudius murders Old Hamlet, and Holzer beats Teddy. These facts aren't in dispute. But what Sleep Deprivation Chamber gestures toward through the dream format and through appropriating Hamlet's doubts about the ghost's testimony is a critique of a criminal justice system criminal justice systems that rely on eyewitness testimony and functionally assume that it's an authoritative way of locating the truth about traumatic events. Thank you.